Hey there.
Hi,
There's Max.
this is Max. She's my flower pot kitten. Found
Oh,
her in an empty flower pot outside my back door, like late last fall.
oh. Well, she's grown. My
Yeah,
goodness.
yep.
Well, how are you doing this week?
I'm good. I had hoped to do some work out in the garden today, but
No, it's
then
great.
it decided to rain like all weekend.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm happy I scored a job. I'm accepting on Monday. So
Congratulations.
thank you. It's been a long time coming. But yeah,
But it sounds great.
if I have any advice to anybody, it's work that network because
Yeah.
that's what's going to do it. Um, okay. Well, shall we launch?
Yes, let's.
Okay. Welcome to Goodnight, Mr. Holmes, a podcast about the Granada Sherlock Holmes, which ran on ITV in the UK between 1984 and 1994, and ran on Masterpiece Mystery in the US around the same time. I'm Laura.
And I'm Rachel.
Today, we are looking at episode 12 in the series, which is called The Redheaded League.
The story was first published in the Strand magazine in 1891.
And it takes place in 1890, I noticed.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and we'll get to that. There was a little notice posted on a door that had a date on it, and it was 1890.
I had my reading glasses on while I was watching this, so I probably missed that date entirely.
So the episode opens on a bustling London street called Saxe-Coburg Street. And Saxe-Coburg, of course, was the surname of the royal family at the time. It wasn't until George V came in that they changed it to Windsor.
Around World World War One, World War Two, they didn't really want to be associated with
Germans. Yes. Yeah, so they decided to take the name of Windsor Castle as their own. Okay, so on the street, two carriages have just collided. The drivers are arguing over who's going to pay. A red-haired man comes out of a pawnbroker's shop. The shop is called Jabez Wilson, to see what the fuss is about, and then he goes back inside. And the camera pans across to another man who's reading a newspaper and observing the scene, and then over to a bank where yet another man, presumably a banker, is knocking on the door of a paddy wagon outside. And he's taking some papers from the police who are inside the wagon. He goes back inside the bank, comes out again, slips another paper into the paddy wagon. The newspaper guy's watching all of this back and forth. Mm-hmm. And the bank guy hops into the front seat of the paddy wagon with the policeman driver, and they take off around the corner as the newspaper guy continues to watch them. And it's this. I found the scene just really confusing.
Yeah. This is very much the heist kind of episode. So there's a lot of this person is doing this and this person is watching this person do that thing with this other.
Everybody's watching everybody else. So the paddy wagon stops at the back door of the bank. The bank guy hops off and he brings out a dolly. And the police start loading up the dolly with these chests that they're taking out of the paddy wagon. And newspaper guy stalks up from behind, and he's continuing to watch as the chests are unloaded and brought inside the building. And sinister music starts playing as the paddy wagon leaves the courtyard of the bank, and newspaper guy runs into the yard, and he picks up a piece of paper that's fallen from the wagon. And then we're in some kind of like library kind of room.
Library / office.
Study. Yeah, we see these barrister bookshelves with the lead and glass fronts. And there's a ladder for reaching the high shelves, and there's a skull on a stand. So it's kind of sinister. And newspaper guy walks across the room to a desk and drops the paper on it. We see a pair of hands with creepily long fingernails.
Yeah, I have a note that this man is due for a nail trim.
Yeah. So he picks up this paper. It's an envelope. So long fingernail guy opens it and finds a receipt for the 4 chests that had been in the paddy wagon. Thousands and thousands of pounds are in those chests. Yeah. So
Doesn't you mentioned a skull in that room? Doesn't Holmes have a skull on the fireplace mantle?
I don't know if he does in this. I know he does in the BBC Sherlock one.
Doesn't he in the stories?
Probably. They wouldn't have.
I don't recall seeing it in this series, but I'll admit I wasn't looking for it.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised because he wouldn't have had it in the BBC Sherlock if it hadn't been in the stories.
Yeah.
Mrs. Hudson took my skull. So Jabez Wilson, he of the bright red hair, is sitting in 221B and he's mopping his brow with a handkerchief. Holmes is reading the newspaper and seemingly ignoring him. And Watson comes in. He sees that Holmes is with a client and he apologizes. But Holmes leaps over the sofa on his way to the door, saying,
I love that moment.
couldn't have come at a better time. And Bending the Willow, that book that I was talking about last week, it describes these kinds of movements as the real Jeremy Brett breaking out of the stringent character of Holmes.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So I can only imagine, how ebullient he is in real life. So Holmes ushers Watson in and does his deduction work on Jabez Wilson's appearance, that he used to do manual labor. He takes snuff. He's been to China. He's done a lot of writing lately. And Wilson is, of course, amazed. He used to be a ship's carpenter, and he does do a lot of writing. Watson's puzzled about Holmes's China deduction, but Wilson has a fish tattooed on his wrist that contains Chinese inks, and a Chinese coin on his watch chain. And so Wilson does the thing that all the clients do. Now that you've explained it, it doesn't seem so clever. And
which doesn't really endear him to Holmes.
no, his face falls a little bit. I'm beginning to think that my reputation, such as it is, will suffer shipwreck if I'm so candid. Omne ignotum pro magnifico, which Watson translates as everything becomes commonplace by explanation. And Holmes scolds him for the loose translation.
Yeah. And Watson translated it as soon as I was done translating it and Google.
Yeah.
Oh, well, could have saved myself that effort.
Right. I did the same thing. And so he instructs Wilson to show Watson the newspaper. So Holmes wasn't really reading the newspaper. He was looking at an advertisement in the newspaper. So he wasn't ignoring Wilson at all. And
Holmes grins at Watson as he hands the newspaper and sits down.
Yes, that almost shark-like.
Yeah.
So the advertisement reads, "To the Red-Headed League, on account of the bequest of the late Ezekiah Hopkins of Lebanon, Pennsylvania, USA, there's a vacancy open which entitles a member of the league to a salary of £4 a week for purely nominal services."
I got a range of values for £4 a week to be anywhere between 431 to 649 pounds today.
Wow.
Yeah.
I would take the job.
Yeah.
All red-headed men, sound in body and mind, and above the age of 21 are eligible. Apply in person on Monday at 11 o'clock to Mr. Duncan Ross at the offices of the League, and it's an address on Fleet Street. So Watson wants to know, of course, if this is serious, and Holmes actually giggles. And he asks Watson to make a note of the newspaper's date. It was 2 months ago. And then he chucks Watson's notebook at him so he can make notes.
And Holmes is sitting sideways on the chair at this point, like his feet resting on an end table.
Exactly. He's really kind of sprawled languidly.
Yeah. Then he tells Wilson, "Off you go at scratch," meaning start from the beginning and tell us about yourself.
So Wilson tells us what we already know, that he's got a pawnbroker shop on Saxe-Coburg Street near the city. And the city in this case doesn't mean London. It means the financial district in London. And it's still called the city to this day.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. When you talk about, I work in the city, that's basically Wall Street.
Okay. Yeah, because I know with the New York City, people in the outer boroughs will talk about going to the city. They mean Manhattan.
Yeah, no, in London, the city refers to the financial district.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, or Westminster, those two things.
Mm-hmm.
So Wilson says he used to have 2 assistants, but he's down to 1 who works for half wages in return for learning the business. And the assistant's name is Vincent Spaulding. And Holmes is really taken by the fact that Spaulding is working at less than market rate. And he calls him an employee, which, okay, employee, I guess it is a French word, but still. Wilson says that Spaulding's keen on photography, always snapping photos inside the shop and then going down to the cellar to develop them. It was Spaulding who first showed Wilson the advertisement. And, here we pan in on the pawnbroker shop where Spaulding is encouraging him to apply, complimenting his red hair. A customer comes in.
Fine, fiery hair.
Yes. A customer comes in. It's newspaper guy. And Spaulding goes over to help him. And Wilson says to Holmes and Watson that he's a homebody and he rarely leaves his shop, but he was interested. Spaulding says he'll come with. So the next Monday, they close up the shop and they went to the address in Fleet Street. Spaulding's being really pushy.
Mm-hmm.
Almost literally, like he's shoving Wilson. We see all
shoving him like all the way to the front of the line.
Yes.
Which is very long.
Extremely long. And the other men in the line are not happy. And they get to a room and Spaulding says, "This is Mr. Wilson," and basically shoves him into the room where another redheaded man is seated at a table with some papers. And the man stands up and greets Wilson with admirably suited every requirement. And he closes the door, keeps all the other redheaded men outside. They're not happy about that. He shakes Wilson's hand, congratulates him, and then he grabs his hair and yanks it. And Wilson yells because it hurts.
Yeah.
And the man says, "They've been twice deceived by wigs, once by paint." The man says his name is Duncan Ross. He looks a little bit like Michael. Oh, God, what's his name? I just lost. Oh, God, he's been in so many things. Michael Keane, I want to say. Anyway, he says he's a pensioner upon a fund left by a noble benefactor, and he goes on to describe Ezekiel Hopkins, another redheaded man.
Which the subtitles translated as Epic Guys Hopkins.
I know, yes. Oh, the subtitles are terrible in this episode, too. So Hopkins left London for America when he was young. He made millions and millions of dollars. When he died, he'd instructed his solicitors to make life a little easier for the redheaded men in the town of his birth.
Yeah, there's a long history of discrimination against redheads.
Gingers.
Yes.
Yeah. Prince Harry talks a lot about that in Spare. Like a lot.
I still haven't read that. I need to read that.
It's so good. When my oldest daughter was dating a redheaded boy, she said the jokes in school were that gingers have no soul. And that's here in New York City in the 21st century.
Yes.
So it's not completely off the wall for a man to want to do this for his fellow gingers.
Mm-hmm. And this isn't too far removed from the Irish potato famine.
Oh, right.
And there's an association with red hair in the Irish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. So Duncan Ross begins questioning Wilson. We find out that he's a widower with no family. Ross's face grows very serious, and he says the fund is for the propagation and spread of redheaded men, as well as their maintenance. But he's willing to allow Wilson into the league because of the bright color of his hair. Ross goes out into the corridor and says the vacancy's been filled, at which point there's briefly a near riot before everybody turns around and walks out. So Ross comes back into the room and Wilson asks about the hours. So the hours are 10 to 2. Wilson says that Spaulding can take over at that time, so he'll do it. He confirms the pay.
Yeah,
and
the mornings at the shop are quiet. So Spaulding can take over. Wow, what a coincidence.
He asks what nominal work means. And Ross says, well, you got to stay in the office or at least the building the whole time. If he leaves, he forfeits the whole deal. He can't call in sick. He can't have a business emergency. And the work is to copy out the Encyclopedia Britannica, beginning with the volume A. Wilson has to also bring his own ink, paper, and pen. But Ross will give him the room, the desk, the chair. They shake hands, and Wilson goes out and joins Spaulding in the hall, and they leave.
almost kind of seems like they want to keep Wilson occupied for a certain time.
Between 10 and 2 every day. So he's kind of suspicious that he has to bring his own supplies. And that struck me as well as someone who's recently out of the job market. Yeah, if someone said that to me, come do this work and bring your own laptop, it's a little shady. But he doesn't.
Well, and Holmes says it's not a very generous millionaire to make you buy your own Pennington paper. Yes. And I'm like, sir, are you familiar with millionaires? This is the most plausible part of the whole thing.
Oh my God. So Wilson shows up.
And Wilson says when he got home, the whole thing seemed kind of ridiculous. And Watson says, why? And like this completely serious tone, not the way I would have said it, which would have been like, wow, really?
Yes. So he goes to Fleet Street. He's greeted by Duncan Ross. Everything seems on the up and up. Every day he goes and copies out of the encyclopedia.
Yeah, he says that he had bought this penny thing of ink and a pen and 7 sheets of foolscap paper. Mm-hmm. Foolscap paper was cut to like 8.5 by 13.5 inches, so it's slightly shorter than U.S. legal paper. And they used to have a watermark of a jester's cap, like various kinds. In that paper made in Europe in the Middle Ages, and eventually the foolscap just became associated with that particular size of paper.
Wow, they still use that size in the UK.
Really? I don't they use? I thought there's an international standard.
There probably is, but I can tell you, having done a lot of work with UK companies, they send you files and they're not the right size for our file folders. So every Saturday Ross comes and gives him his pay, and Wilson likes the work because he's learning. And he's burbling on to Ross every Saturday as they're leaving. Ross could not care less, which is also weird. Like, he gave him this assignment, but he really doesn't care.
Yeah.
About the contents.
Again, kind of like they just want him to be not in his shop for a while.
Yes. So Wilson in 221B is rattling off the various entries he's copied. Watson's trying hard not to giggle. Holmes shoots him a disapproving look, and Wilson tells him he'd finished the letter A and was going to move on to volume B that morning, when suddenly the whole business came to an end. He showed up at the office, but it was locked with a card tacked to it saying the Red-Headed League is dissolved from this day. And there's a date.
At least they left a sign.
Yes, there's a date, and that's where the 1890 comes in, and it's signed Duncan Ross. So Wilson accosts this other man in the hallway. He's an accountant with his own office, and asks what happened to Duncan Ross. And the accountant doesn't recognize the name, but he does recognize the description and says, oh, his name's not Ross, it's William Morris. And William Morris is the name of a famous designer. Mm-hmm. He created designs for a lot of different types of wallpaper that you would see. Yeah. All that ornate stuff in Victorian rooms. So this
William Morris is pretending to be a solicitor.
So he was using the office temporarily till his new one was ready. He moved out yesterday, paid in full. Wilson asks where he can find him, and the accountant rolls his eyes and says, in his new offices.
Which would be where, sir?
He pokes his head inside his office and gets the new address, gives it to Wilson, who trots off immediately. He goes to the address he was given near St. Paul's Cathedral, knocks on the door, and then he sees the sign next to the door, Burke & Son, manufacturer of artificial kneecaps. And at this point, Watson can't hold it in any longer. He just starts laughing so hard, and Holmes joins in. I mean, it's just too good. Wilson scolds them, saying he doesn't see anything funny about it, and if all they're going to do is laugh at him, he's going to go.
You can feel sorry for him, but it is also really funny.
It's hilarious. Artificial kneecaps. Holmes pulls himself together, jumps up, prevents Wilson from going, and he says, I wouldn't miss this case for the world. It is most refreshingly unusual. And Wilson's still pissed, so Holmes asks his forgiveness for laughing at him. Watson says he doesn't understand what the problem is. Wilson's been paid. He's got detailed knowledge on every subject under the letter A. But Wilson naturally wants to know why this prank has been played on him.
I mean, I know why, because I've read the story and I've seen the episode before, but even if I hadn't, the obvious starting place is his pawn shop.
Yes.
The obvious motive was to keep him occupied away from there. And then because there weren't any obvious changes to the place or he would have noticed, you'd then think about this helpful assistant and his photography hobby in the basement, and you'd want to look there and ask about the assistant, which is what Holmes does.
Yes, exactly. So this Spaulding guy's been with Wilson for 3 months. He had answered an ad. There were 12 applicants, but Spaulding offered to work at half wages. Wilson describes him as tall, slender, very quick in his ways, with a white splash of acid on his forehead. And Holmes asks,
and his ears have been pierced for earrings.
Yeah. And Wilson says, yeah. And Spaulding told him a gypsy had done it when he was younger. Holmes asks if he will be at a shop later today. And Wilson said Spaulding was encouraging him to close up and spend the rest of the weekend with his sister in Barking because he was so rattled by this experience. And Holmes says,
I'm sure his sister would love to have a man show up at her door and say, hey, I'm really rattled with this business. I'm just going to stay with you for the weekend so you can take care of me. You're like, sure. It's not like I didn't have 5,000 other things I need.
Exactly.
Thank you for the notice.
Holmes says they should have an answer by Monday. Wilson asks about Holmes's fee, and Holmes says he believes it will be paid for by another. So he kind of already has a sense of what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
After he leaves, Holmes asks Watson what he makes of the whole thing, and Watson says he can't make sense of it. And Holmes says there are greater issues hanging from this affair than had first appeared, which is kind of a callback to Omne Ignotum Pro Magnifico.
Mm-hmm.
And then he smokes his pipe. He's sitting.
It's a 3-pipe problem.
Yes, he's sitting in his chair with his knees up. And yeah, he tells Watson it's a 3-pipe problem. I beg you won't speak to me for 50 minutes.
Yeah, Watson sits down like he's been asked to also just stay right there and don't make a sound.
Yeah, he sits down and he waits.
Yeah, I'd have gotten a book and read it in another part of the room, but staring at the wall works for you. Go for it, I guess.
Well, we see later that he does have a book in his lap.
Is it a book or a newspaper? I thought it was a newspaper.
I thought it was a book, but I mean, anyway, he has reading material, and he's fallen asleep.
Yeah.
But, next we see Duncan Ross, now with no red hair. In fact, he's balding. So the red hair was...
Well, in the middle, we get another view of the strange guy who needs to trim his fingernails.
Yes. Well, that's what I'm saying. He's walking up to this man in the room, and he's saying, the business of the Red-Headed League has concluded, sir. And long-nailed man puts his hand on Ross's shoulder and says, satisfactorily, I trust. Most satisfactorily, Professor, I am pleased to report.
Wow, I wonder who this guy is.
So, I mean, yeah, we know that the long-nailed man is Moriarty.
Yeah, none of that is in the original story, by the way.
No, they're setting us up for the next episode.
Yeah.
Because we'll get into that, but the next episode, the story occurs like out of nowhere. But in life, you have to set these things up.
Yes.
So as Ross goes back downstairs, Moriarty's looking at a map of Paris. Holmes, meanwhile, is still in his chair, his arms wrapped around his knees. He's absolutely surrounded in smoke. He suddenly jumps up and taps Watson on the shoulder. Watson's fallen asleep, and they race out the door. Outside Jabez Wilson's pawn shop, Spaulding is like working on the windows or whatever when Holmes and Watson come up to him. And Holmes asks the way to the Strand from there, and he's drumming his stick on the pavement. And Spaulding directs them. As they head off, Watson says, I could have told you. But Holmes shoves him around the corner and says to be quiet. Watson asks why he beat his stick on the pavement, and Holmes says, we are spies in an enemy's territory. Spaulding goes inside the pawn shop. Holmes and Watson cross the street, and Holmes is kind of doing that thing where he's looking at buildings and adding things up.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says, and I love this, it is a hobby of mine to have an exact knowledge of London. And this is similar to today's the knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
which is an understanding of every single, and I'm not lying, every single London street, alleyway, whatever, that the drivers of the black cabs have to know. And I've experienced this. I get in a cab at Heathrow and say, I'm going to Rathbone Place, which is this tiny, like, it's a 1 block lane, and they know exactly where to go.
As opposed to New York City, where if you don't give them the cross streets, they're like, where's that?
Yeah. But in London, there's a whole test that takes years and years and years to study for. And yeah, so if you are qualified to drive a black cab, you know every inch of London. And, you know, the implication is that Holmes does too.
Mm-hmm.
So they're standing outside the nearby bank. And Holmes and Watson both make a note of all the shops and the businesses on the street. Holmes tells Watson not to write any of it down because he thinks they're being watched. And they head around to the back of the bank where Holmes says a considerable crime is in contemplation. But that's all they can do for today. And there's a concert at St. James's Hall. And of course, Watson adds a sandwich and a cup of coffee.
Of course, we have to eat Holmes. Not all of us can exist on air.
And then Holmes replies, and then off to violin land in all its sweetness, delicacy, and harmony. And Watson says, and no redheaded clients to vex us with their conundrums. So, interestingly, the violinist in question is Sarasate. He's a real life conductor and composer and violinist.
Mm.
He's Spanish, and he's got quite an oeuvre. Holmes is completely, wrapped. His eyes are closed. And yes, Watson feels a sense of foreboding for the criminals that Holmes was after. At which point, of course, we go back to Moriarty.
Yeah, he feels that an evil time is coming upon those whom he has set himself to hunt down. Because he looks so happy. I love that.
Yes. Yes. If Holmes is happy, is this skullduggery going to happen? So Moriarty's up in his library/office. He's examining a map of Saxe-Coburg Square. The bank and the pawn shop are noted on the map. The pawn shop's kitty corner from the bank across the intersection of Saxe-Coburg Street and Pilgrim Street. Back at 221B, Watson's drawing this exact same map on Holmes's chalkboard. And Holmes kind of flies into the room with his dressing gown over his suit. And he's saying he's asked Inspector Jones to come to 221B. He's an absolute imbecile, but he does have the tenacity of a lobster when he gets his claws into someone.
I love that description.
I know, me too. So Jones arrives with a Mr. Merriweather in white tie and tails, no less. Mr. Merriweather is expressing some skepticism about amateur investigations, but Holmes reassures him, or not what Holmes, Jones reassures him, Holmes is weird, but he has the makings of a detective in him. And Holmes is in the next room washing his hands, and he just calls out, "Ha!"
He has his own methods, which may be a little theoretical and fantastic. Yes, they are so fantastical that they have become the basis for our current crime scene investigation.
Yes. So he learned that Merriweather is head of the bank. And he's saying to Watson that there's no possibility of it being broken into. Even insurance assessors agree. And Merriweather, he's in a snit. He's saying it's the first time in 27 years he's missed Saturday dinner at his club. And I find myself extremely inconvenienced. And Jones is kind of rolling his eyes.
Must be a pleasure to live with.
Right? God, I can't even imagine being the wife of someone like that. Holmes comes out of his room. He's wearing a pea coat and he's carrying a lantern and a weird kind of stick. It's short and it's got like a cloth strap on the bottom of it, and the top is curved. It's like a curved handle shaped kind of like an ibis's bill, like narrow and curved.
Mhm.
It's a weird stick. He tells Meriwether that he'll find tonight's game, quote unquote, much more exciting than a Saturday night at his club, and the stakes are high, many, many thousands of pounds. Jones asks what his reward's going to be, and Holmes tells him a young man called Clay. John Clay, Jones says, I'd like to get my hands on that devil. Clay is supposedly a gentleman that's turned against his own class. He's as cunning as the devil.
I found that turned against his own class very interesting.
I did too. And that Holmes was just willing, not Holmes, Jones was just willing to accept that as a thing, right? Like recognizing he's not in that class.
Yeah, policemen generally weren't. And they were, I think probably still at this time, looked down upon as being lower class.
Well, and if you're a gentleman, you don't have a career.
Right.
You know, you make your living off the rentals of the people leasing your land. So you don't have a job. So you can't be a professional, in other words. You can only be an amateur, which is why Holmes is, quote unquote, an amateur detective. This Clay is an accomplished bank robber and forger. And Holmes adds that Clay's grandfather was a royal duke. And I was trying to figure out who that could be. But at the time, there were a lot of them. They got winnowed out when they shifted the name from Saxe-Coburg to Windsor. At the same time, a lot of these German royal dukes were kind of downgraded, which is why Louis Mountbatten, for example, who was a key member of the royal family, was just an earl. He was Louis Battenberg from Germany. So Clay was educated at Eton and Oxford. So Watson, bring the gun. like there's a cause relationship there. They proceed out the door to the cab downstairs. They stop at the bank where Meriwether gets out and goes inside. Then they go around the corner to the back of the bank, and Meriwether comes out and lets them in the back door. And of course, down to the vault they go. Holmes is shining his lantern. It's totally unlit. Meriwether says there's only 2 keys. He has one. The bank chairman has the other in his personal safe. And as they enter the vault, Holmes asks Meriwether to be quiet and tells him to sit on one of the chests and not to interfere. And I mean, Meriwether just keeps getting more and more put out as this goes on. Holmes is putting an ear to the wall, and Meriwether says there's no way a thief could break into this bank. And then Holmes asks if there's a specific reason why a thief would want to break into the bank. Something in the past few months, something you have concealed from us. And Meriwether says he has information that is meant only for the bank directors, not for amateur detectives. And Jones kind of looks askance at this. And Watson interjects, private consulting detective, Mr. Meriwether, unique in the annals of crime. Isn't that so, Inspector?
I looked up when private investigators needed a license in the UK, and apparently they don't.
Wow,
There's no mandatory system.
You have to have one here.
Yeah.
So Jones advises Meriwether to cooperate, especially, Holmes says, because at this moment, I am trying to save your skin and that of your fellow directors. I mean, he's just basically owning Meriwether at this point. Meriwether says the bank has borrowed 60,000 gold Napoleons from the Bank of France. And we remember that Moriarty was looking at this bank, this map of Paris. So the reserves at this particular branch are much larger than usual. Holmes asks where it is, and Meriwether says Watson's sitting on half of it in a chest lined with lead foil.
Yeah, so Napoleon's, the Napoleon is a kind of slang term for coins that were issued by Napoleon Bonaparte during his reign in France. The name doesn't seem to be specific to a denomination. They were originally issued in like 20 and 40 francs, question mark. But, you know, after a while, they, you know, it could be just
anything. So Watson gets up, Merriweather unlocks the chest, Holmes pulls back the foil, and they look at the gold coins. And Holmes puts his ear to the wall again, and we hear these faint chipping and banging sounds. Outside, a policeman is like rattling the bars that are locking up the bank's back door. So we know there's a cop out there. 4 men inside are waiting in silence. Holmes and Jones are crawling on the floor, listening. And Holmes whispers, "This is much larger in conception than I originally thought. Wouldn't you say, Jones?" And Jones agrees because Clay is more of a spur of the moment type of criminal, not the long planning sort, he says. Unless he's a pawn in a much larger game, Holmes says.
Should there be a master criminal involved, do you think?
He tells Merriweather that someone knows about the gold. There's a criminal mastermind. And Jones says, "Are you suggesting that?" And Holmes says, "It's bearing all the hallmarks of Professor Moriarty's work."
Dun, dun, dun.
Exactly. And Watson looks stricken and he just says, "Moriarty." Merriweather asks who Moriarty is, as do we all. And Jones says they don't know what he looks like because no one's ever seen him. Holmes says he's a man of good birth, excellent education, but he has hereditary tendencies of the most diabolical kind. A criminal strain runs in his blood, which is increased and rendered infinitely more dangerous by his extraordinary mental powers. He is the organizer of half that is evil and nearly all that is undetected in this great city. He is never caught. His agent is caught, but the central power is never caught and certainly never suspected. We shall not see the professor tonight.
And also we won't see him tonight because he was not in this original story.
No. So the chipping and banging sounds grow louder. Jones says there's policemen at the doors of the pawnbrokers. Holmes tells the men to take up their positions. We don't know what these positions are supposed to be because we weren't in on that. He asks Merriweather to put out the lamp, and Merriweather, very indignant, he says, "And sit in the dark."
Yeah, also, they were hardly in the dark once all those lamps were off.
Exactly.
Oh, lamps are off? Why doesn't it look like it? So were those supposed to be, were the lamps supposed to be candle or oil or something?
I think they were electric.
Yeah, that's what I thought too.
But they couldn't turn them off. They had to put these covers.
Yeah, they had to put the covers on because they didn't have that flickering
No,
that you would get with the flame. They were very steady.
Steady. Yep.
Battery-operated flashlights, I looked this up, were invented around 1899, so that would have been anachronistic.
Well, maybe this
Not
was
to say that they weren't actually
I was gonna say,
battery-operated.
maybe this was a precursor. I mean, there's certainly no cords
Yeah.
or any place.
Maybe they were just like, oh my God, who is going to look this up on something called the internet, like
Us.
40 some years from now?
Us. So Holmes takes another lamp. So they're not in the dark because he's got his lamp. He goes over to Watson and says, "When I shine the light, close in quickly. If they fire, have no compunction about shooting them down." And Holmes is kind of flipping around this weird stick. And he puts out his lamp. We see the policeman checking on the entrance to the pawn shop. Pawn shop is empty. Back in the vault, we hear banging and scraping. A hand reaches up from a hole in the floor and pushes away a concrete slab, and a man hoists himself up. It's Spaulding. He's beginning to lift someone else out of the hole when Holmes shines the lamp at him. Spaulding lets go, telling the other man to jump. Holmes swats a gun out of his hand with the stick. The curved handle was really good for like grabbing his wrist and flinging the gun away. So Spaulding's surrounded. And Holmes says, "It's no good, John Clay. You have no chance at all." "So I see," says Clay, "but I fancy my pal is all right." But Holmes tells him the police have got his friend too. Holmes and Clay compliment one another. And Jones starts to handcuff him, but Clay tells him to step back. You may be aware that I have royal blood in my veins, and be so kind as to say, sir, and please when you address me.
Yeah, and Jones responds pretty much the way I would. Oh, if you please, sir, come with me to jail.
and we notice at that point he does have this acid stain on his extremely high forehead. He's got a 5 head. And yeah, like you say, Jones is very amused, and he tells him to march upstairs. Well, we get a cab to transport your highness to the police station. And Clay's like, yeah, that's better. And as he's leaving the vault, he bows deeply to Holmes and Watson. And as he and Jones are leaving, Holmes asks if Moriarty's behind all of this. I suggest you keep that name off your lips, Mr. Holmes, says Clay, if you value your future well-being. Merryweather, meanwhile, is nearly a changed man. He's bubbling compliments. He's never seen anything like it. And Holmes is very stern with him. He says, I've spared no expense in this matter, which I expect the bank to refund. He's really...
What expense did he go to?
I don't think it even matters. He's just mad because Merryweather's a pissant. And
Merryweather spent most of the time insulting him.
Yes, Merryweather says, of course, whatever you want. Back at the pawn shop, Clay's accomplice, who is a newspaper guy from the opening scene, pops through a hole in the floor. He starts to leave, walks straight into the police outside, and backs into the pawn shop again. There's a tussle, a lot of broken china.
Yeah, a tussle is putting it mildly. It's like they're throwing everything in the shop at each other. Oh, let me just knock over this entire bookcase filled with stuff.
And that's how they get him, because they pull the shelf down on top of him. So then we're in the library/office where we finally see Moriarty's face coming out of the shadows. It's very sinister. And he's saying, it won't do, you know. And he's looking at Duncan Ross. No, Professor, I'm sorry we failed you, Ross says. Sherlock Holmes, and Moriarty interrupts him, is a mere amateur in the field of detection. Still, he seems a clever man or a lucky one, and he has a positive talent for getting in my way. Should he be removed? Ross asks. It may be necessary. It would be disappointing. I find him interesting. I believe this is the 3rd time he has incommoded me. If this continues, something will certainly have to be done. And Ross looks very uncomfortable. He walks off. Moriarty thanks him, which is civil of him. Ruffles up the map of Saturday.
At least he's a polite master criminal.
Yes. I mean, he doesn't shoot the guy for like not completing the job. The next morning, Watson's at the pawn shop. It is a complete and total wreck. Wilson is super upset, saying the whole situation has ruined him. His credibility is shot.
But on the plus side, we found out what the motive was for the red-headed lady.
Yes. Watson tells him to cheer up. You'll feel better when you've cleared up the mess. And then he hands Wilson a little bag with 50 sovereigns in it, with the compliments of the City and Suburban Bank.
Of course, that's about 8,118 pounds today.
Wilson is understandably overjoyed.
As I would be.
Same. Watson leaves the shop, but he's admonishing Wilson on his way out. Next time you engage an assistant, pay him the proper wage. And Wilson looks very unhappy at that. Watson meets up with Holmes at a bookshop. He says he doesn't understand how Holmes knew what was really going on in all that chaos. And Holmes said, when I heard that the assistant had come in for half wages, it was obvious to me that he had some motive. Had there been a woman in the house, I would have suspected immediately some vulgar intrigue. But when I heard from Mr. Wilson about the acid stain in the pierced ears, I knew that Vincent Spaulding and John Clay were the same person. But why was he there? And Watson said, the photography gave you the clue. And Holmes says, exactly. He was working on something in the cellar, something that took many hours a day. He was tunneling, but where to? When I tapped my stick on the pavement, I was ascertaining whether the tunnel stretched in front or behind the building. It was in front, towards the bank.
I question whether he could have heard that.
Yes, obviously. It's not like
rapping at a wall.
A wall, right? It's cement. And Holmes also noted that Clay's knees were wet and dirty. They spoke clearly of many hours of tunneling, because
I mean, that's a pretty good giveaway.
would not be on the, hands and knees mopping the floor, which also would give you wet and dirty knees. When Wilson had finished volume A of the encyclopedia, they closed up the Red-Headed League because the tunnel was complete and there was no need to keep him out of the pawn shop. And they would make the attempt on Saturday. That was just a guess, Watson asks. Watson, you disappoint me, said Holmes. I never guess, which he's always saying.
Which he's always saying incorrectly.
He completely guesses. Saturday's an excellent night for stealing bullion. It gives you an extra day to escape.
Banks are closed on Sundays.
Let me put that on my calendar. Steal bullion on Saturday night. As they leave the bookshop, Holmes says, sometimes I think my whole life is spent in one long effort to escape from the commonplaces of existence. And Watson's like, no, you are a benefactor of the race. And then Holmes says, l'homme c'est rien, l'heure c'est tout, as Gustave Flaubert wrote to George Sand. And that translates as the man is nothing, the work is everything.
Mm-hmm.
And as they go inside 221B, we see Moriarty watching them ominously. Dun, dun, dun. Next episode.
To be continued.
Yes. So I loved this because a bunch of real life stuff.
Do tell.
Yes, the Hatton Garden heist.
Mm-hmm.
This was in 2015. Hatton Garden Safe Deposit Inc. was burgled in a similar way. There was a 4-day Easter bank holiday. The surrounding businesses were also closed. The burglars tunneled through and drilled through the vault. There were 7 of them in total. They were all older men. They were like grandpas. They set off the burglar alarm, but the police just didn't respond to that.
Why?
Yeah, police incompetence. Ultimately, they were caught, and it is still the largest burglary in English legal history.
Wow.
And there were 6 movies or miniseries made out of this. Timothy Spall was in one of them. Yeah, a bunch of grandpas robbing a bank.
Well, you got to do something after you're retired.
Exactly. Yes.
Everybody needs a hobby.
Also, in 1971, a burglar was directly inspired by the Red-Headed League and robbed a bank robbed a branch of Lloyd's of London on Baker Street. They rented a shop a couple. That's
almost an insult.
I know, right? They rented a shop a couple doors down, and tunneled over and through. Only a little bit of that money was ever recovered. Most of it, yeah, it was anywhere between 1 and 3 million pounds.
Wow. And
they only got about 200,000 pounds. But they were caught because they used their real names to rent the shop. Yeah.
Gotta pay attention to the details, guys. Yes. The details that will bring you down.
But who knows where that money went? Anyway, I just love this. And I love that, like, burglars continue to take their inspiration from the story.
It seems to work out pretty well for them as long as they, manage the details.
Right, exactly.
I mean, they can steal it. They just need to work on the whole getting away part.
Yes. Well, in Hatton Garden, they didn't get away. They were all caught. On Baker Street, they were caught, but the money is gone. So, yeah, who knows? Yeah, Hatton Garden, I remember when that happened. Because I was still going to London for work at that time. And it was like the hugest deal. And there were all these like, the British panel shows, quiz shows and stuff, where the comedians also, there were so many references. It was insane. It is like one of these pivotal moments in English history. The grandpa's robbing the bank.
And that's why you need to visit your grandparents.
Yeah, keep them busy so they don't. Anything else we need to add to this?
I don't think so. Sorry, the pause was because a cat just jumped onto the table next to me, and I didn't want them to jump on my computer and turn it off.
There's always that threat because it's happened.
Yes.
Suddenly you disappear. It's because a cat hit the off button. So what's in
I
store?
I really liked this too.
Yeah, me too.
It was just a really fun episode.
Yes. Yeah, we're entering so next week's episode is the final episode in this kind of block
Yes.
of the series. Then it's a couple years later and they pick it up again.
Mhm.
And the stories, the way it's described in Bending the Willow, they're scraping the barrel, they're getting down towards the bottom of the barrel towards the end of the whole series.
Mhm.
But we're not there yet. We're still in the best stories.
Yes.
So, and Holmes is, Jeremy Brett is spry. He can jump over a couch.
Leap over a couch in a single bound.
Yes, he's not in a wheelchair on oxygen like he was in the last episodes. So what's next?
Oh, that's all from us this week. If you've enjoyed the show and haven't subscribed yet, you can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you want to support us, you can leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Tell your friends. And join us next week when we'll be discussing the final problem.
Yay!
Or is it the final problem?
It's not. Cool. All right. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.